The letter was typed in Times New Roman, size 12, double-spaced. You have to respect the commitment. In an age of hastily thumbed emails and all-caps Facebook rants, this was a carefully constructed, physically printed piece of passive aggression. It was, in its own way, a work of art, an artfully crafted declaration of war. It rested on my granite countertop, a stark white rectangle of condemnation in my otherwise peaceful kitchen. My mug of coffee, still steaming, seemed to mock me with its warmth, a warmth I was now apparently forbidden from achieving through the burning of simple firewood. The letter began, "Dear resident of 12 Maple Drive," as if they'd forgotten my name was Alex, despite the fact that the sender, one Carol Peterson of 14 Maple Drive, had stared directly into my soul just last Friday. I'd only been in Oak Creek for 3 months. I cashed out a decade's worth of stock options from a soul-crushing software engineering job in the city to buy this place. Not a mansion, just a respectable 2-story colonial with blue shutters, a decent-sized yard, and a glorious, honest-to-God brick fireplace. My entire suburban fantasy was built around that fireplace. I pictured myself in a comfortable armchair, a glass of overpriced whiskey in hand, a roaring fire crackling merrily as I read dense historical novels and contemplated the quiet dignity of middle-class life. I had the chair, I had the whiskey, and last Friday, for the first time, I had the fire. The day had been perfect. A crisp, classic October Friday. The air was sharp, the leaves were a riot of gold and crimson, and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. It was the kind of day that demands a fire. So I did my due diligence. I'd had the chimney professionally swept and inspected. I'd purchased a cord of seasoned oak, guaranteed to burn clean and hot. I followed every city ordinance to the letter. By 7 o'clock, my dream was a reality. A modest, well-behaved fire danced behind the grate, casting a warm, flickering glow across the living room. It was sublime. The gentle scent of wood smoke was barely perceptible, a faint, pleasant whisper on the evening air. I was cocooned in contentment, deep into a book about the fall of the Roman Empire, when the knock came. It wasn't a friendly, neighborly knock. It was a sharp, percussive thump, 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 the kind of knock that implies you're 10 seconds away from a battering ram. I opened the door to a woman who looked like her face had been in a permanent state of disapproval since the Carter administration. She was short, wiry, and dressed in a beige tracksuit that seemed to absorb all the joy from its immediate surroundings. In her arms, she clutched a Pomeranian that was less a dog and more a sentient bundle of fluff and indignation. This was Carol. "Can I help you?" I asked, squinting into the porch light. She pointed a finger towards my roof. Her nail was long and dangerously sharp. "Your chimney," she said, her voice tight with suppressed outrage. "It's smoking." I glanced back into my living room at the fireplace, then back at her. "Yes," I said slowly, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "That's generally how they work." "Are you aware of the particulate matter you are releasing into our shared atmosphere?" she snapped. "My Pomeranian, Prince Fluffington, has a sensitive respiratory system." The dog in question sneezed, a tiny performative peep. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, not sounding sorry at all. "It's seasoned oak, burns very clean. I'm well within city regulations." "The Homeowners Association bylaws are very clear about nuisances," she countered, the word nuisances dripping with venom. "This is a nuisance. It smells like burning." "Again, that's the desired effect." Her eyes narrowed. She whipped out a smartphone with a rhinestone-covered case and began taking pictures of my chimney, the flash cutting through the darkness. "I am documenting this. This is unacceptable. We have standards in this neighborhood. We don't just go around fouling the air with our combustion byproducts. I was starting to lose my patience, a resource I usually have in abundance. "Ma'am, it's a legal, safe fire in my own home. It's barely 40 degrees out. I'm going to go back inside now." "I will be reporting this," she declared to my closing door. "You'll be hearing from the HOA." I had laughed it off. I'd dealt with cranks before. I figured she was just a lonely woman who got her thrills from enforcing imaginary rules. I went back to my fire, finished my chapter, and thought nothing more of it. Until this morning. Until the letter. I picked it up again, reading the key line for the 10th time. "A formal complaint has been filed regarding the emission of excessive and bothersome atmospheric pollutants, specifically smoke with a pungent and unpleasant odor originating from your property." Pungent? It was oak. It smelled like a cozy cabin in the woods. This wasn't about the smoke. It was about power. She'd identified me as a new resident, an unknown variable, and she was establishing dominance. She was the alpha, and my fireplace was a challenge to her authority. My mind raced. I could fight her. I could attend the next HOA meeting, armed with city ordinances and a PowerPoint presentation on the thermodynamic properties of seasoned hardwood. It would be a long, drawn-out, soul-crushingly boring war of attrition. It would be miserable. Or my eyes drifted to the kitchen counter, past the dreaded letter, to a half-empty bottle of bubble solution. My 7-year-old niece, Maya, had left it here last weekend. We'd spent an hour in the backyard, filling the air with shimmering, iridescent spheres. She had shrieked with delight with everyone that floated past her face. A slow grin spread across my face. It was the kind of grin that promised chaos. A truly idiotic, magnificent, and beautiful idea began to form in the engineering-focused recesses of my brain. Carol had a problem with the emissions from my chimney. She found them to be a nuisance. Fine, I would solve her problem. I would give her emissions she couldn't possibly complain about. I would weaponize joy. Game on, Carol. The path to enlightened revenge is paved with absurd Google searches. My browser history for the next 3 days was a federal agent's nightmare. High-volume bubble generator schematics. Industrial foam dispersal systems. Heat-resistant surfactants. Can you power a 12V motor from a chimney flue? The answer is no, not easily. Non-toxic scented oil compounds safe for inhalation. How to not burn down your house with a DIY bubble machine installed in a chimney. That last one got a lot of clicks. My garage, once a pristine space for my sensible sedan, transformed into a mad scientist's laboratory. My whiteboard, normally reserved for mapping out software architecture, was now covered in frantic sketches of pumps, reservoirs, and airflow diagrams. I was in my element. This was just another engineering problem, albeit one with a much more satisfying end-user experience than optimizing database queries. The first step was a proof of concept. I needed to know if I could even generate the sheer volume of bubbles required. My niece's little plastic wand wasn't going to cut it. I needed something bigger. Something with power. The first call I made was to my best friend, Dave. Dave is also a software engineer, but he has the soul of a rogue demolition expert. He appreciates elegant solutions, but he adores spectacular chaos. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me you didn't get fired." "Even better," I said, pacing around my garage. "I'm going to weaponize joy." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him processing this. "You've finally snapped," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and giddy excitement. "What is it this time? Did you build a robot to argue with people on the internet for you?" "Close. I'm building a bubble machine from my chimney to appease the neighborhood dragon." Another pause, this one longer. Then a slow, deep chuckle. "Oh, this is about the smoke complaint, isn't it? Tell me everything." I laid out the entire plan. The complaint, the letter, the absurd idea. I explained my goal of creating a system that would, on demand, turn my chimney from a source of Carol's rage into a fountain of pure, unadulterated delight. "I'm in," he said without a moment's hesitation. "This is the greatest thing I've ever heard. One question, though. Can we make them smell like bacon?" "Bacon is too aggressive," I countered, tapping a pen against my whiteboard. "It could be construed as a nuisance. We need a scent that is legally unimpeachable. Something so wholesome, so disarmingly pleasant, that complaining about it would make her look like a monster." "Freshly baked bread?" he offered. "Close," I said, a brilliant idea striking me. "Even better. Freshly baked cookies. Chocolate chip, to be specific. It's the Trojan horse of scents. Nobody hates the smell of cookies." My initial prototypes were, to put it mildly, a disaster. Attempt #1, the simple approach. I bought a high-powered fan and rigged it to a simple pump submerged in a bucket of concentrated bubble solution. I aimed it at a large, custom-made bubble wand. I switched it on. The result was less a magical stream of bubbles and more a pathetic, sputtering foam that dribbled from the wand and pooled on the garage floor. It looked like my chimney had contracted rabies. Failure. Attempt #2, the thermodynamic disaster. My next thought was to use the natural heat and airflow from the chimney itself. I theorized that the rising hot air would be enough to lift and form the bubbles. I built a small, heat-shielded rig and placed it in the base of the chimney, while it was cold, of course. I then lit a very small, controlled fire. The heat did, in fact, create a powerful updraft. It also heated the bubble solution to its boiling point, creating a sudden burst of hot steam that instantly popped every single bubble upon formation. The entire house smelled like boiled, unscented soap for 2 days. A catastrophic sudsy failure. Attempt #3, the bubblepocalypse. I finally cracked the bubble generation itself. The trick was a series of high-speed spinning wands dipped in a shallow, constantly replenishing trough of solution with a carefully calibrated fan behind them. I perfected the bubble formula, a custom blend of dish soap, glycerin for strength, and a dash of corn syrup for longevity. It worked. Oh, it worked too well. I had the contraption on my workbench, making some final adjustments to the motor speed. My finger slipped on a screwdriver, shorting 2 terminals. The machine roared to life, not at the 10% power I was testing, but at 100%. A torrent of bubbles, thick and dense and smelling gloriously of chocolate chip cookies, erupted from the device. I scrambled to unplug it, but it was too late. In less than 30 seconds, my entire 2-car garage was filled, floor to ceiling, with a mountain of shimmering, fragrant bubbles. The garage door was open. The bubbles began to spill out onto the driveway in a slow, silent, sudsy avalanche. Just then, an Amazon van pulled up. The driver, a young guy with a man bun and a look of perpetual boredom, got out. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the river of foam pouring from my garage. I emerged from the bubble mass, covered head to toe in suds, holding a useless power cord. We locked eyes. He looked at the bubbles, at me, back at the bubbles, then slowly placed my package on the edge of the driveway, well out of the foam's path. He took a picture with his phone, gave me a slow, confused nod, and drove away without a word. It was at that moment, standing in my driveway looking like a foam-covered cryptid, that I realized I needed help. The bubble generation was solved, but the installation, the integration into the chimney flue itself, was beyond my expertise. I needed a professional. I needed a contractor who was skilled, discreet, and most importantly, wouldn't ask too many questions. Or, if they did ask questions, would be amused by the answers. I spent an evening scrolling through local listings, past polished corporate websites with stock photos of smiling families. I needed someone old school. I found him on page 4 of a Google search, Gus's Fabrication and Repair. The website looked like it was designed in 1998. The slogan was simple: if it's broke, I'll fix it. If it ain't, I'll leave it alone. Perfect. Gus showed up the next day. He was a man in his 60s, built like a retired refrigerator. He had a thick gray mustache, hands like leather work gloves, and eyes that had seen things you couldn't imagine. He walked into my garage, which I had mostly debubbled, and looked at my whiteboard. He took in the complex schematics, the chemical formulas for the bubble solution, and the heading at the top that read, Operation Bubble Storm. He stood there for a full minute, just looking. He didn't speak. He just processed. Finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Son," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you want me to put a bubble machine in your chimney?" I decided honesty was the best policy. A high-output, scented, non-toxic, particulate-free atmospheric delight delivery system, yes. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the whiteboard. "Why?" "My neighbor complained about my chimney smoke," I said flatly. He blinked. "Her name Carol?" My jaw dropped. "How did you know?" "I did a deck for her 3 years ago," Gus grunted. "She handed me a 17-page document outlining the acceptable decibel levels for my power tools. Said my circular saw was upsetting her Pomeranian." A bond of shared trauma formed between us in that moment. "I need it mounted inside the flue," I explained, showing him the device. "It needs a dedicated power line, and the whole thing has to be shielded from the heat and weatherproofed. And I need a remote control actuator." Gus circled the bubble machine, poking at it with a calloused finger. He examined my welds, my wiring. He picked up the remote I'd built from a modified garage door opener. I was sure he was going to laugh in my face, tell me to get a hobby, and walk out. Instead, a slow, magnificent grin spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You know," he said, "back in '96, a fella out in the rich part of town paid me $5,000 to install a motorized disco ball in his master shower. This ain't the weirdest thing I've done." He paused, looking back at my creation. "But it's in the top 5, a real work of art." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Let's get to work." Gus was a master. He became my co-conspirator, the grizzled veteran to my mad scientist. He fabricated a custom stainless steel housing, engineered a clever heat shield, and ran the wiring so discreetly you'd never know it was there. We spent the better part of a week on it, a silent, efficient team united by a common cause, the pursuit of profoundly petty, yet beautiful, revenge. The day of reckoning was a Saturday. The air was cool and carried the scent of fallen leaves, the kind of day that practically begs for a cozy fire. It was perfect. The system, my beautiful, ridiculous creation, was installed, tested, and armed. Gus had left the day before with a final approving grunt and a handshake that nearly pulverized my knuckles. The remote sat on my coffee table, a small black rectangle holding untold potential for chaos. My finger twitched with anticipation. For the sake of plausible deniability, and for my own amusement, I had set up a small, discreet security camera pointed at my front yard. It was disguised as a birdhouse. I told myself it was for security. I knew it was for posterity. Phase 1 was theater. I needed to set the stage. I made a grand show of it all. I stacked a few logs in the fireplace grate, crumpled up some newspaper, and made sure the flue was open. From my living room window, I had a clear view of 14 Maple Drive. As predicted, Carol's blinds twitched. A sliver of a shadow appeared, then vanished. She was watching. The dragon was in her lair, waiting for the first puff of smoke to breathe her fire. I let the tension build. I made a cup of tea. I sat in my armchair and pretended to read my book. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. Years of engineering experience, a week of frantic building, and a significant invoice from Gus all came down to this one moment. I sent a quick text to Dave. T-minus 5 minutes to Operation Bublicious. Commence popcorn acquisition. His reply was instantaneous, a string of a dozen popcorn emojis. I took a deep, steadying breath, picked up the remote and walked casually to my front door, stepping out onto the porch. I wanted a front row seat. My thumb hovered over the big red button. I gave a polite, neighborly wave in the direction of Carol's house. Then I pressed the button. For a single, heart-stopping second, nothing happened. A familiar pang of failed prototype anxiety washed over me. Did a wire come loose? Did the motor burn out? Had I made some colossal, embarrassing miscalculation? Then I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible hum from deep within the brickwork of my chimney. It grew into a soft whirring sound, like 1,000 tiny wings beating in unison. And then it happened. A single, perfect bubble emerged from the top of the chimney. It was large and perfectly spherical, catching the afternoon sunlight in a shimmering, iridescent swirl of color. It drifted lazily upwards, carrying the faintest, sweetest scent of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. It was followed by another, and another. Then the trickle became a stream. The stream became a river. A thick, silent, utterly magical torrent of bubbles began to pour from my chimney. They didn't burst. My custom formula, perfected in the great garage bubble-pocalypse, made them resilient. They floated gently downwards, a cascade of silent, fragrant joy, blanketing my front lawn in a shimmering, moving carpet of suds. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Down the street, a group of kids playing street hockey stopped mid-game, their mouths agape. One of them, a little girl with bright red pigtails, let out a squeal of pure, unadulterated delight and charged into the bubble stream, her arms outstretched. The others followed, their hockey game completely forgotten. They were laughing, shouting, trying to catch the biggest bubbles, their faces turned up to the sky. A few adults wandered out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. They stood on their lawns, looking utterly bewildered. A man who I recognized as Tom from a few houses down took a tentative step onto my lawn, caught a bubble, and sniffed his hand. A slow, confused smile spread across his face. "Is that cookies?" he mouthed to his wife, who just shrugged, equally baffled and amused. My front yard, the very source of the neighborhood's recent strife, had become the epicenter of a spontaneous, surreal block party. It was better than I ever could have imagined. The peace, of course, was not to last. The front door of 14 Maple Drive slammed open with the force of a cannon blast. Carol marched out, her beige tracksuit a beacon of fury in a sea of whimsical bubbles. She had her phone clamped to her ear, and she was gesticulating wildly as she stomped across her perfectly manicured lawn and onto mine, a feat I'd never seen her perform before. The bubbles parted around her like she was a malevolent Moses parting the Red Sea. "What is this?" she shrieked, the sound cutting through the children's laughter. "What is this toxic chemical foam you're pumping into our air?" I took a serene sip of my tea, which I had wisely brought out with me. I gave her my most placid, unbothered smile. "Good afternoon, Carol," I said cheerfully. "Isn't it a lovely day? To answer your question, this is my new, eco-friendly chimney emission system. 0 particulates, fully compliant with all city and state environmental regulations." "This is not compliant. This is an assault." She was practically vibrating with rage. Bubbles were landing in her stiff, hair-sprayed coif, clinging to her like tiny, shimmering parasites. "Oh, not at all," I said, gesturing to the scene around us. "It's a multi-sensory neighborhood enhancement experience, and the scent is specifically chosen for its calming properties. This batch is Grandma's Kitchen. You know, chocolate chip cookies. It promotes a sense of community and well-being." "I'm calling the police!" she screeched. "The fire department, the EPA, the CDC." "Go right ahead," I said, my smile unwavering. "There's no fire, there's no smoke, and the bubble solution is 100% biodegradable, hypoallergenic, and non-toxic." I leaned in conspiratorially. "Perfectly safe for Prince Fluffington, even with his delicate constitution." As if on cue, the fluffy Pomeranian, who had been hiding behind Carol's legs, suddenly forgot his litany of respiratory ailments. He caught a whiff of the cookie-scented air, his little nose twitching. He broke free, yapping with excitement, and began joyfully leaping and snapping at the low-floating bubbles. It was a beautiful, profound betrayal. Carol stared at her traitorous dog, her face a perfect mask of horror and disbelief. That was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had won. Her call to the police, however, was not a bluff. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street and parked at the curb. The flashing lights looked surreal as they reflected off the millions of floating bubbles. 2 officers got out. The first was older, with a mustache that had seen more than its fair share of donuts, and a weary expression that suggested nothing could surprise him anymore. This was Officer Miller. The second was young, bright-eyed, and looked like this was his first truly weird call. This was Officer Ramirez. Carol practically ran to them. "Officers, thank God. This man," she pointed at me with a trembling, bubble-flecked finger, "is polluting the entire neighborhood with this unauthorized whimsy." Officer Miller surveyed the scene. He looked at the laughing children, the amused adults, the bubble-covered lawn, the traitorous Pomeranian happily chasing his bliss, and then at me, standing calmly on my porch. I could see the corners of his mustache twitch. He was fighting a losing battle against a smile. He walked over to me, his pace slow and deliberate. "Sir," he began, his voice a perfect deadpan, "can you explain to me what's, happening here?" "Just trying to be a considerate neighbor, officer," I said with earnest sincerity. "I received a formal complaint about my chimney smoke being a nuisance, so I took it upon myself to engineer a solution that wouldn't bother anyone. It's a closed-loop system, no combustion involved." Officer Ramirez, meanwhile, was speaking quietly into his shoulder radio. I could just make out his words. "Dispatch, be advised. We have a bubble situation at 12 Maple Drive. No casualties. It just smells like cookies." I produced the bottle of my bubble solution, which I had conveniently labeled with a full, professional-looking list of ingredients. "As you can see, it's just soap, water, glycerin, and a food-grade allergen-free scent extract, safer than most air fresheners." Officer Miller took the bottle, read the label, and handed it back to me. He then turned to Carol, his expression now one of profound exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice heavy, "there's no law against this. He's not breaking any city ordinance. There's no ordinance against bubbles." "But it's a nuisance," she insisted, her voice cracking. "From what I can see," Miller said, gesturing to the happy crowd, "it's the most popular nuisance this neighborhood has ever had." He gave me a look that was one part warning and one part deep, unspoken respect. "Sir, try to keep the atmospheric delight confined to your own property as much as possible." He tipped his hat, and he and a still baffled Ramirez got back in their cruiser and drove away. Carol stood there, utterly defeated. The police, her ultimate weapon, had sided with the Bubbles. The neighborhood had sided with the Bubbles. Her own dog had sided with the Bubbles. A large, particularly resilient bubble drifted down and landed squarely on the tip of her nose. It popped with a soft pfft. She didn't wipe it off. She just turned, her shoulders slumped, and marched back into her house, a silent, sudsy retreat. The war was over. In the digital age, nothing so beautifully strange goes undocumented. By Saturday evening, the first video had appeared on the local news station's Facebook page. It was shaky cell phone footage filmed by one of my neighbors, showing the river of bubbles, the laughing kids, and the entire surreal interaction with the police. The caption read, "Local man's bizarre and bubbly response to neighbor's complaint in Oak Creek." By Sunday morning, it had been picked up by a few minor blogs. By Monday, it was a certifiable grade A viral sensation. My quiet suburban street was the setting for TikToks set to whimsical music. Twitter threads debated the legality and morality of weaponized pleasantness. Someone had dubbed me the Bubble Baron. Dave was having an absolute field day, sending me a constant stream of memes, articles, and screenshots. One was a doctored image of me as a superhero, a cape on my back and a bubble wand in my hand, with the caption, "Not the hero we deserve, but the hero we need." I got a call from a producer for a national morning talk show asking if I'd be willing to fly to New York to share my story. I politely and very firmly declined. My 15 minutes of fame was 15 minutes too long. The real changes, however, were happening right here on Maple Drive. The bubble storm hadn't just defeated Carol, it had broken her spell over the entire neighborhood. Her power was derived from the assumption that everyone would quietly bow to the HOA's labyrinthine and often nonsensical rules. She was a paper tiger, and I had just hosed her down with soap and water. People started talking to me, really talking. Not just the polite nod you give when grabbing the mail. Tom from a few houses down, the guy I'd seen sniffing the bubbles, came over while I was raking leaves. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, leaning on his own rake. "Seriously, that was epic." "Just trying to keep the peace," I said with a shrug. He chuckled. "You did more than that. That woman," he nodded towards Carol's house, "made me dismantle my 7-year-old's treehouse last summer. Said the untreated pine wasn't a pre-approved earth tone. My kid was heartbroken. The next day, a woman from across the street named Sarah stopped me while I was getting in my car. "You're the bubble guy, right?" she asked with a grin. "Carol wrote me up 2 months ago because she measured my lawn with a ruler and claimed it was 1/4 of an inch over the regulation 3-inch maximum height. 1/4 of an inch!" Story after story started to emerge. Carol had forced someone to repaint their perfectly fine mailbox because it was the wrong shade of black. She had tried to get another family's golden retriever designated as a repetitive noise nuisance. She was a one-woman committee on misery, and for years, everyone had been too tired or too intimidated to fight back. My ridiculous, over-the-top stunt had been a declaration of independence for the whole block. I had inadvertently become the leader of a suburban rebellion I never intended to start. The HOA called an emergency meeting, of course. Carol, in a desperate attempt to regain control, had put forth a new amendment to the bylaws. Article 9, Section C, a prohibition on the airborne dispersal of any scented, foaming, or otherwise non-gaseous agents from a residential structure. It was a spectacular failure. The meeting, which normally had about 4 attendees, was packed. Tom stood up and gave an impassioned speech about his son's treehouse. Sarah brought a ruler and waved it around while talking about her lawn. When Carol's amendment came up for a vote, it was defeated by a landslide. She had lost her grip completely. A few days later, I saw her. I was taking out the recycling bins, and she was at her mailbox. It was the first time we'd seen each other since the police had left. I braced myself for another confrontation, a new line of attack. But it never came. She saw me. Her posture stiffened. Her face, which had been in a neutral, mail-sorting expression, hardened into her familiar mask of disapproval. She snatched her letters from the box, slammed it shut, and marched back inside her house without a single word. She didn't even look at me. It wasn't a truce. It wasn't an apology. It was a surrender. The glare was all she had left. There would be no more letters, no more surprise knocks, no more complaints. The war was over. Won not with angry words or legal battles, but with the disarming absurdity of cookie-scented bubbles. Standing there on the curb, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had set out to engage in an act of profoundly petty revenge. I wanted to annoy a single irritating woman, but the result was something else entirely. I hadn't just made a point. I'd accidentally built a community. I had fought absurdity with greater absurdity and, in the process, stumbled upon a truth. Sometimes the best way to deal with people who take themselves too seriously is to refuse to take them seriously at all. Maybe there was a lesson in there somewhere. Or maybe, just maybe, it was proof that deep down, everyone just really loves bubbles. The Bubble Chimney, as it was now affectionately known, became a local institution. It wasn't an everyday thing, of course. I wasn't running a 24/7 bubble factory. But on clear Saturday afternoons, when the air was just right, I'd fire it up for an hour. It became a signal. The low hum of the motor would start, and soon the gentle, scented river of bubbles would float across the neighborhood. It was the New Age equivalent of an ice cream truck jingle. Kids would appear first, running out of their houses with a Pavlovian glee. Then the parents would follow, setting up lawn chairs, chatting, and enjoying the simple, bizarre spectacle. Maple Drive had never been so sociable. I became a bubble sommelier of sorts. I expanded my repertoire of scents. October had been Grandma's Kitchen, but November was Pumpkin Spice Latte, a scent so basic and beloved it was beyond reproach. For the holiday season in December, I unveiled Fresh-Cut Pine Tree, which was a massive hit. Dave was still lobbying for bacon, but I held firm. This was a benevolent regime, not a breakfast-themed dictatorship. One Saturday, while the air was thick with the scent of pine and the laughter of children, a familiar pickup truck pulled up to the curb. Gus got out, a can of beer in his hand. He walked onto my lawn, surveyed the happy, bubble-filled scene, and stood beside me. He took a long sip of his beer. "You know," he said, watching a group of kids try to build a bubble snowman, "that disco ball shower shorted out in a week. Flooded the guy's bathroom." He looked over at my chimney, still churning out its silent, festive foam. "This is better." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Top 5 for sure." He finished his beer, crushed the can in one hand, gave me a nod, and left. It was the highest praise I could have received. The story culminates a few months later. Spring has arrived, and the trees on Maple Drive are bursting with green. The bitterness of my first few months here feels like a distant memory. To celebrate, I decided to host a neighborhood barbecue. Not for any special reason, just because I could. The final scene is my backyard. It's filled with people. Tom is at my grill, flipping burgers like a seasoned pro, his son directing the operation from a newly rebuilt and proudly unpainted treehouse in his own yard. Sarah is here, laughing with a group of other neighbors over a bowl of potato salad. Kids are running through sprinklers. It's noisy and chaotic and wonderful. The big chimney is dormant today. It's too warm for a fire, and its purpose has been served. But for the kids, I have a small, store-bought bubble machine humming away in the corner, churning out a steady stream of regular, unscented bubbles. I'm sitting in a lawn chair with a cold beer, watching it all unfold. Dave is next to me, a smug grin on his face. "You know," he says, "for a guy who just wanted to be left alone, you've become a real pillar of the community." "It was an accident," I insist, "a strategic miscalculation with a positive outcome." "Whatever you say, Bubble Baron," he says, laughing. "You single-handedly defeated an HOA tyrant and brought a neighborhood together, all because you didn't want to stop using your fireplace." I look around at the happy, smiling faces. He's right. This is what I'd pictured when I dreamed of suburban life. Not the sterile, rule-obsessed quiet that Carol enforced, but this messy, vibrant, joyful peace. I just had to take the most ridiculously complicated route to get here. As I'm taking a sip of my beer, I happen to glance over the fence towards 14 Maple Drive, and I see it. The faintest twitch of the blinds in her living room window. She's watching, but the blinds close immediately. There's no storming over, no angry phone calls, just the silent, impotent observation of a queen in exile. Just then, a little girl, the one with the red pigtails from the very first day, runs up to me, her face sticky with ketchup. "Hey, mister," she says, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Can you make the bubbles smell like cookies again, please?" I look at the smiling faces, at the peaceful community I accidentally built, and at the quiet house next door. My work as a warrior of petty revenge is done, but my work as the neighborhood's official purveyor of joy, it seems, has just begun. I grin. You know what? I think I can do that. I stand up, heading inside to flip the switch. Not out of spite, not anymore, but just because it's fun. And in the end, that was the most powerful weapon of all.